She hung up before I could say another word. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone against my chest, listening to the silence of a house that had been in my family for 41 years. Outside, the oak trees my father planted before I was born were turning gold in the October light. I could hear the wind moving through them the way it always did this time of year, slow and patient, like something that had learned to wait. My son had just told me he was selling the farm. Not asking, telling. I set the phone down on the counter and looked out at those trees for a long time. Then I did something my son probably didn't expect. I smiled, because my son, for all his confidence, had made one very serious mistake. And I had known about it for 6 months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. Because this story only makes sense if you understand what this land meant, and what kind of man my son had become without me ever quite noticing it happening. My name is Raymond Earl Covington. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years building Covington Agricultural Services from nothing, a one-truck soil testing operation in rural Kentucky that eventually grew into a regional consulting firm, serving farm operations across 4 states. I worked 7 days a week for most of my adult life. I drove used trucks. I wore the same boots for 6 years at a stretch. Everything I earned went back into 2 things: the business and the land. The land was the Covington Farm, 214 acres outside Harlan County, that my grandfather had worked, that my father had expanded, and that I had spent the better part of my adult life preserving. It was not a showpiece. It was not a hobby. It was the kind of land that gets into your blood the way nothing else does, with creek bottoms and ridge lines and soil that had been turned and rested and turned again across 4 generations. My wife Margaret passed 9 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 17 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After she died, my son Garrett and his wife Dana moved back from Nashville, and I was glad for the company. Garrett had always been bright. He had an MBA from Vanderbilt, a sharp mind for numbers, and the kind of easy confidence that made people trust him immediately. Dana was quieter, but more calculated. I see that clearly now. I did not see it then. For the first 2 years, things were fine. I handed Garrett the management of the consulting firm, kept my name on the ownership documents, and let him run the day-to-day operations. He did well. Revenue increased. He hired good people. I stepped back further and further, spending my time on the farm, doing the things I'd put off for 3 decades. Fixing fences, planting a kitchen garden, sitting on the porch in the evenings the way my father used to do. The shift happened gradually. I know that sounds like something people say when they're embarrassed they didn't notice sooner, but it's the truth. There was no single moment. There was just a slow accumulation of small things. Conversations I wasn't included in. Documents that needed my signature without much explanation. A general sense that decisions were being made around me rather than with me. Then Garrett came to me about the farm. He sat down at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, just the 2 of us, and he laid out what he called a financial restructuring opportunity. He said it calmly, the way he'd learned to say difficult things at Vanderbilt, with charts on his laptop and phrases like asset liquidity and estate planning efficiency. The core of it was simple. He wanted me to transfer the deed of the farm into an LLC he had structured, with him as managing member. He said it would protect the asset, reduce my tax exposure, and simplify the eventual inheritance process. I asked him several questions. He had answers for all of them. Good answers. Technical answers. The kind that are designed to satisfy without actually informing. I told him I'd think about it. What I did instead was call my attorney. Her name is Patricia Ellsworth. She has handled my legal affairs for 22 years. She is 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and she does not like to be lied to. I drove to her office in Lexington the following week, and I put Garrett's proposal in front of her. She read through it twice. Then she looked up at me over her glasses and said, "Raymond, this LLC structure gives Garrett unilateral authority to sell or encumber this property without your consent. You would retain a minority interest, but lose all practical control." I said I thought that might be what it meant. She said, "Do not sign this." I told her I had no intention of signing it. Then, I asked her something I had been turning over in my mind for weeks. I asked her whether there was anything about the farm's legal status that Garrett might not know, something that would matter if he ever tried to move on it without me. She got very quiet. Then, she opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder I recognized. Inside, it was a document that had been executed in 1987 by my father before the farm passed to me. A mineral rights reservation clause, recorded separately from the primary deed, that had never been transferred in any of the subsequent title transactions. Under Kentucky law, that reservation was still valid, still attached to the land, and it created a legal encumbrance that made the property legally unsaleable without the mineral rights holder's written consent. The mineral rights holder was a trust established in my father's name. I was the sole trustee. Patricia explained that in the current climate, with natural gas exploration activity increasing in eastern Kentucky, those mineral rights had become significantly valuable. She had, without my knowing, received an inquiry about them 3 months earlier from an energy company. She had held off on mentioning it because she wasn't sure I wanted to sell. I told her I didn't want to sell, but I wanted to know exactly what those rights were worth, and I wanted everything documented. She had the appraisal done within 2 weeks. The mineral rights, conservatively valued, were worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on the exploration outcome. More importantly, any sale of the surface property, the farm itself, without clearing the mineral rights encumbrance, would almost certainly fail title review. I went home, and I didn't say a word to Garrett. I watched him for the next 4 months. I watched him charm the people at my firm's Lexington office. I watched him take Dana to Hilton Head in September, which he mentioned was a business development trip. I watched him handle himself with the casual confidence of a man who has already decided how the future is going to look. Then, in early October, he called me. He said he'd been approached by a real estate investment group out of Cincinnati, interested in purchasing agricultural land in Harlan County. He said the offer was strong. He said the number was just over $1.2 million. He said he'd already spoken with a title company and was moving forward with the paperwork. He said, and I remember these words exactly, "Dad, I'm doing this for both of us. This land is just sitting there. We need to turn it into real wealth." I said, "Garrett, that farm has been in this family since your great-grandfather broke the first acre." He said, "I know, Dad, but it's time to be practical." I said, "When did the deed transfer?" There was a pause. Then he said, carefully, "I've been working through the estate planning structure we discussed. I want to get the paperwork finalized before the end of the year for tax purposes." I understood then. He hadn't transferred the deed. He was planning to have me sign documents without explaining what they actually did, the way he'd almost done with the LLC. He was going to present it as routine estate planning, and I was going to sign over control of the farm, and then the sale was going to happen, and I was going to be left with whatever fraction of the proceeds he decided was appropriate. I said, "I see. Let me think about it." He said, "Don't wait too long, Dad." I said, "I understand." I called Patricia that same evening. I told her everything. She said, "Raymond, are you ready to let this play out?" I told her I was. She said she'd need about 3 weeks to get everything in order. I said, "Take 4. I want it to be airtight." Over the next month, Garrett called me 7 times about the sale. Each time, I gave him a version of still thinking it over that was just vague enough to keep him patient. Dana called me twice. The second time she said, with a warmth that did not reach her eyes, "Raymond, you've worked so hard your whole life. Don't you deserve to enjoy some of that? The money from this sale could set you up beautifully." I thanked her for her concern. I said I was still reviewing the paperwork. What I was actually doing during those 4 weeks was meeting with Patricia, meeting with the energy company representative, and restructuring the Mineral Rights Trust in a way that made the path forward very clear. I also, at Patricia's suggestion, I had a quiet conversation with the senior partner at my firm's accounting service, a man named Walter Breen, who had been my accountant since 1994, about the financial management of Covington Agricultural Services. Over the past 2 years, what Walter showed me was not embezzlement, exactly. It was more subtle than that. It was a pattern of expenses approved without proper documentation, consulting fees paid to vendors that Walter had never been able to fully verify, and a series of internal transfers that had reduced the firm's retained earnings significantly, while Garrett's personal compensation had increased. It was the kind of thing that is very hard to prosecute but very easy to explain to a board of directors. I did not sleep well during those weeks. I want to be honest about that. This was my son. Whatever he had become, I had raised him. I had sat with him through fevers and nightmares, and the first terrible heartbreak of his life. I had taught him to drive a tractor on this farm when he was 12 years old. Sitting in the kitchen at night, I would look out at those oak trees and feel something I can only describe as grief. Not for the farm, not even for the money, but for the version of my son I had believed in for 67 years. But then I would think about what Dana had said on the phone, the warmth that did not reach her eyes. And I would remember that the man who called to tell me a sale was already in motion had not asked me once how I was doing, had not asked about my health, or my sleep, or whether I was eating. Had spoken to me entirely as a transaction to be managed, and I would feel the grief harden into something steadier, something clear. Garrett came to the farm on a Saturday in November. He brought Dana, and he brought a man I didn't recognize, young, in a suit that was slightly too expensive for Harlan County, carrying a slim leather portfolio. Garrett introduced him as a closing coordinator from the title company. He said they just needed a few signatures to finalize the estate planning documents, and then they'd go over the details of the sale together. He said it the way people say things when they have already decided the answer and are only performing the question. I invited them all inside. I made coffee. I set out the good cups, the ones Margaret had picked out at a shop in Gatlinburg the year before she got sick. Dana commented on them, said they were lovely. I thanked her. Then I said, "Before we look at any paperwork, there are a few people I'd like you to meet." Patricia Ellsworth walked in from the living room. She had driven from Lexington the night before and stayed in the guest room. Behind her came Walter Breen, and behind Walter came a man named Dennis Holt, who was the regional counsel for the energy company that had been inquiring about the mineral rights. Garrett's expression didn't change right away. That was the MBA training. He could hold his face still under pressure. Dana was less practiced. She looked at Patricia, then at me, and something behind her eyes shifted. I said, "Garrett, Patricia has prepared a legal summary I'd like you to read. Take your time." Close. Patricia set the document in front of him. It was 11 pages. It outlined the mineral rights encumbrance in full, the trust structure, the current appraisal, and at the end, the findings from Walter's financial review of the firm's accounts over the preceding 26 months. I watched my son read. I watched the stillness in his face develop small cracks, the way plaster does when the foundation settles. He got to page 4 and stopped. He looked up at me. He said, "Dad." I said, "Keep reading." He read to the end. The closing coordinator from the title company had gone very quiet. He was young enough that he probably hadn't understood, when he took this assignment, that he was walking into something like this. When Garrett set the document down, I spoke first. I said, "The farm cannot be sold without the mineral rights, because no title company in this state will clear it with that encumbrance on record. The mineral rights belong to the trust I control. I have no intention of releasing them. That means the sale you've been arranging without my knowledge or my consent, using documents you plan to have me sign without full disclosure, is not going to happen." Garrett said, "Dad, I was trying to." I said, "I know what you were trying to do." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees. Then Dennis Holt spoke. He said that his company was prepared to make a formal offer for a lease on the mineral rights, not a sale. A lease that would generate significant annual income without requiring the property to change hands. He named a number. It was not a small number. I said I would be interested in discussing the terms. Dana said, Raymond, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Patricia said, very calmly. There hasn't been, and I'd recommend consulting your own attorney before you say anything further. Garrett looked at me across the table for a long time. I looked back at him. I thought about the 12-year-old boy on the tractor. I thought about the man he had decided to become. I thought about the 7 phone calls about a sale that was already in motion before he had bothered to tell me about it. I said, I've also spoken with the firm's board of directors about the financial irregularities Walter identified. They've engaged an outside auditor. That process is separate from this conversation and will proceed regardless of what happens here today. The closing coordinator quietly picked up his portfolio and stood. He said he thought he should excuse himself. Garrett didn't stop him. In the weeks that followed, the audit produced what it produced. Garrett resigned from Covington Agricultural Services in December, before the board could formalize any action. He and Dana moved back to Nashville shortly after. We have spoken twice since then, brief, careful conversations that held more of what was not said than what was. I do not know what will happen between us over time. I have learned not to make predictions about the future of things that matter. What I do know is this. The farm is still here. The oak trees my grandfather planted are still here. The mineral rights lease was finalized in February, and the annual income from it is enough that I no longer need to draw from my savings. Patricia is handling the firm's legal affairs directly now, with a management team the board selected. Walter has dinner with me once a month. 277. On a Tuesday in late March, I drove out to the back of the property, to the ridgeline where you can see 4 counties on a clear day. I sat on the tailgate of my truck the way my father used to do, and I looked out at land that had been in my family for 4 generations, and I thought about what it means to fight for something without raising your voice. My father used to say that patience is not the same as weakness, that the willingness to wait, to prepare, to let a situation develop until the truth of it is fully visible, that is its own kind of strength. He said quiet men are often mistaken for soft men, and that this mistake is one the other person almost always pays for eventually. I think about that a lot these days. The land is still here. I am still here. And for the first time in a long time, sitting on that ridge in the March wind, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. I felt like myself.